can be built upon different bases. They can be built on a philosophy, and why a person or a country has a worldview. It can be built on philosophy, such as Platonism. It could be built on a religion, such as Israel in the Old Testament. You can, of course, call a religion a philosophy, and vice versa, a philosophy a religion, but I'm separating them purposely. Israel in the Old Testament had a worldview. And what is a worldview? It's the way that you look at and attempt to organize and explain your existence and your world. She had a way that she attempted to do that, and it was her faith in God in the Old Testament revelation. You could have a worldview based on mythology. You could have a worldview based on political ideology. Now that would be similar to the Soviet Union. A worldview, the way they view the world, religion, economics, everything based on a political ideology and so forth. But it's probably true that many cultures have a mixture of the above. But one will surely end up being dominant. And I think to discover which one dominates in our country, we'd have to look at the bases. Is ours mythology? Whatever our worldview is, we've got to ask the question, well, what would the basis of it be? Well, that's hardly true. Mythology. What about religion? We've discussed this before regarding the myth of a Christian America. If religion is the basis for whatever worldview we have in this country, if religion is the basis for that, then I think the religion would be Christianity. It certainly wouldn't be another form of religion. It would certainly be Christianity. But Christianity, I think most knowledgeable people would say, is not the religion of this country. It's not the basis for the worldview of this country. And probably it never has been. What about politics in this country? Could that be the basis? Well, we seem to be heading toward control by a central government. Amen. We're not there yet, but we seem to be heading in that direction. Now, the founding fathers of this country made some specific provisions for the states to have their own independence. Not independence to the point of seceding from the Union as those down south tried to do in the Civil War, but still that they are to have their independence. And because of the money that comes from the federal government today, states are finding themselves more and more in line with federal government and less independent from that. When you can get not millions, billions of dollars of federal government funds, if you do this and you do that and your system is this way or that way in your state, then since the bottom line is often a fiscal monetary bottom line, I think the states often surrender independence in favor of following the federal government so that they can get the money. What about philosophy? I think that philosophy would probably be the better choice, or let's say the best choice, for a basis of the American worldview. But which philosophy? There are so many of them. Well, we're going to get into that here in just a moment. I would still say that every culture is probably a combination of bases. Even if it's a single basis of philosophy, it's a combination of many philosophies that then serve to undergird the Weltanschauung. The Germans have that good one-word term that means, well, a systematic way of looking at the world. We call it a worldview that any country has. Now, what I want to start with this morning is looking at how interesting this suffix is. Ism. I-S-M. Those three letters, whenever they're put together, placed on the end of a word as a suffix, are very interesting. They greatly alter the meaning of the word itself. That suffix turns words that are just of a general sort, kind of a neutral term, to one that represents a system of thought or a worldview. Now, I have jotted down just a list of these that I thought of, where you can take a word, add an ISM suffix to it, and turn it into a worldview. So I want to give you a list of some of these that I've thought of, and you could extend this probably for a long time yourself. But take the term intellectual. Is there anything wrong with having an intellect? Well, that's one word. What about intellectual? Well, I don't see anything specifically wrong with intellectual, that I approach that from an intellectual point of view, if we mean by that just with my intellect, with my mind. What about when you add an ISM to it, though? Intellectualism. Now, I'm going to show you just a little tidbit about the English language. Whenever you add an ISM suffix, you change a word from just a general term, not necessarily neutral one, but I mean just a general term that maybe could be bad or could be good, could be evil, could be right. You change it from that to a definite worldview, a definite outlook on life. Intellectual, intellectualism. How about the word social? I think we should be social creatures. We were made social creatures. We weren't made to live alone, but to live with others. What about socialism? You see, we've changed the term. Natural. Comes from the word nature. We believe in nature. Don't you believe in acting natural around people? What about naturalism? Modern. Modernism. National. Nationalism. Some of these words I'm covering we're going to be looking at later. Most we won't. Feminine. Now there's another good term. I think it's good for a woman to be feminine. What about feminism? We're to a worldview now, an outlook. You've changed it from just, let's use the term neutral, from a neutral word, feminine. It just is a neutral term, to feminism. Now we know what you mean by that. That's a radical worldview. It's a way that you look at the world. Behavior. Behaviorism. One form, one aspect of certain trends in 20th century psychology is behaviorism, like B.F. Skinner. Behavior to behaviorism. Military, militarism. Evangelical, evangelicalism. It's a tongue twister. It's rather long. Evangelical, that just comes from the Greek word euangelion, that means the gospel. We're evangelical. We believe in the gospel. But evangelicalism, now that is a certain expression of American Christianity. And now you even have neo-evangelicalism. I would certainly say we're evangelical, but are we involved in evangelicalism or neo-evangelicalism? Well, you see, that's a worldview. And you'd have to know, well, what are all the tenets of evangelicalism? Evangelical just says you believe the gospel. You believe in preaching the gospel. Evangelicalism, ISM, you change the meaning of that word now. You've turned it into a systematic way of looking at things or presenting things. Moral, moralism. You hear of that, and you hear people call you maybe moralistic. And that's generally, it's always used in a negative sense. We believe in morals, but moralistic like you legislate morals and you're a legalist, and it has all these other connotations attached to it. Impression gets off into the arts. Impressionism. Then this is really into the arts. Exhibition. This is a natural art. Exhibitionism. Now, do you know what exhibitionism is? Do I have to tell any of you what that means? Yeah, it means to show off. Everything, right. Yeah. Exposing or exhibiting the wrong part of the body. Now, what's wrong with the term exhibition? Nothing. Exhibitionism. Peace. How do we get an ism out of that? Pacifism. Yeah, peace, pacifism. The Bible teaches peace, it never teaches pacifism. Plural. Pluralism. You're going to see how, as we discuss some of these, how they are a complete worldview in themselves. Nothing wrong with the term plural, especially if you're talking about cars or homes or clothes. You want plural of them. Money, but pluralism, that's another matter. There's not even talking about the term plural. Liberal, liberalism. Now, you might not even like the term liberal, but it's good to be liberal in the right area. It's good to be liberal. You can just take your giving. Isn't it good to be liberal in giving? Well, so I'm a liberal, you would say. Now, because liberalism has become so strong, now even the term liberal has mostly, maybe 90% bad connotation to it and 10 good. But I'm saying that these words are neutral in the sense they could go either way. If you take the ism off, they could go either way. Feminine could be good, I guess, unless it's describing a man, then it could be bad. So it could go either way. It's a neutral term. Feminism is something else. Subject. What do we get out of that? See, subject is a good term. Subjectivism. That's not a good term. Not when it's pressed to its extreme. Pragmatic. Pragmatism. Positive. Positivism. Some of these we discussed earlier, by the way, way back at the very beginning of Christian ethics. We discussed things like pragmatism. Pragmatic is good to be pragmatic, but what about when you sell all out to the pragmatic way? Then it becomes pragmatism. Positive is good to be positive. Positivism is a worldview that's not good. Relative. Relativism. Exist. It's good to exist. It's very good to exist. What do we get from exist? Existentialism. Another tongue twister. Exist is good. Existentialism, generally it's bad. I can make it good if I use it the right way. I believe in being existential, but certainly not in the Kierkegaard way. What about Narcissus? Narcissus is just a plant. It's a name for a plant. Narcissism. Egocentricity. You've turned it into a worldview now. Narcissus to narcissism. What about nihil? N-I-H-I-L? Nihilism. You know what nihil means? Just nothing. It's nihil. You used to use that word sometimes. It's nihil, nothing. Fine word. You see that word used in Catholic books all the time. Nihil obstat. What does that mean in Latin? Nothing's in the way. The Roman Catholic Church has put its imprimatur upon this. Nothing is in the way. This book is fine to be published and read by the Catholic people. See, some words that we have in English, most words that we have in English come from Greek and Latin. It's sometimes good to kind of know their origin there. Nihil obstat. Some of you are looking funny at me. Just means you're probably not from a Catholic background. Oh, you are, but you're a dumb Catholic. Nihil obstat. You know, I'm not an artist. I'd try to draw the little imprimatur up there. I could write the word. That'd be good enough. But you often find that. Nothing is in the way for the publication and reading in this book, a nihil obstat. But what do we get from nihil? Nihilism. Nothingness. And whenever it becomes a radical form of nihilism, like a Nietzsche nihilism, then you're in big trouble. Well, I think that should demonstrate the point sufficiently enough, and you can go on and on and on with the list, but I think I've given you some of the better known ones, except one that we'll get to here in a moment, and some of the ones that you might think of first of all yourself as well. But the point is, since we're going to be using ism terms, I wanted you to see what an ism term is. That you can take kind of a neutral word and add this ism suffix to it and change it into a worldview. So, with that in mind, let's just start discussing one of these isms this morning. And we put it first because I'm going to say that it's the umbrella of American worldview-isms. American life, as we know it at the end of the 20th century, is controlled by a philosophy. I think that our worldview in this country has a philosophical basis, not mythological, political, religious. It has a philosophical basis. There are so many different philosophies. I think our culture is a combination, is a mixed bag combination of them. But one in particular is so important, so overarching, that it actually becomes the dominant one. Now, when I say dominant, I don't mean that it crushes or pushes aside all of the others. But by dominant, I mean that it's the umbrella. It's so broad and comprehensive. It's the umbrella under which all of the other smaller philosophies that make up the total American way of life find their common existence. Okay? So we're going to name one of these. It's the dominant one. That'll look like that. And then underneath this, we're going to go, someone's asked me how many we're going to cover. I don't know exactly, but between 5 and 10, I would say. But the most important thing we can say about any of them is this one is going to serve as the common denominator, the umbrella. And what is that? Well, that's when you take this term and you add your ISM. Secularism. Now, I don't know what you would have selected. I think this is the right one to select. If someone asked you, what is the dominant worldview in American society at the end of the 20th century? I would hope that we would say secularism. You say, well, what about some of these others? Well, we're going to see why this dominates. It doesn't mean that it crushes or pushes aside, but it's so far extending, it's so broad, and the others aren't this broad, that all the others can find their common shelter and a common denominator in this one. That even though we do have others like modernism or naturalism that may have taken over the biological or the theological sciences, secularism is much broader and can cover all of these underneath it. All right? Well, let's get into some of the background of this term. We're going to spend maybe as long as 10 weeks on secularism. We'll have to see. I think the best thing to do is probably start with the Latin basis for this. I'm going to have to add another term up here as well. Mundus. Okay. We get secular. Secular now, it even has a bad name. Of itself, without the ISM suffix, it even has a bad name. But secular is not necessarily a bad term. Depends on, again, how you use it. Secular is not necessarily a bad term. Generally, it's used with an evil reference. Secularism is always bad. Remember that whenever you add the ISM on these and turn them into a worldview, if it's not in line with the word, then that worldview is always bad. The list that I just gave you, intellectualism, socialism, naturalism, modernism, they're always bad. Some not as bad as others. Evangelicalism. You see, they deviate too many places from the Word of God and form their own system. Not as bad as the others, but it's still not scriptural. Seculum can be translated world. I really don't need those quotation marks, probably, as you'll see. It doesn't make any difference. I don't want to be too technical in this type of study anyway. But seculum in Latin means world, and mundus means world as well. So you say, well, what's the difference? Well, let me describe it to you like this. Two of the best-known attributes of God are His eternalness and His omnipresence. His eternalness and His omnipresence. He is neither time-bound nor place-bound. You've said two things about God when you ascribe to Him eternalness, and omnipresence. He is neither time-bound, eternalness, nor place-bound, omnipresence. But we're both of those things. We're both time-bound and place-bound. We live in a very time, place-oriented world, or our existence, I could say it another way, is a very time, place-oriented existence. So, some of the older languages, we have it in ours as well, but it's interesting how these are translated into ours, like Latin and Greek, have words that are often translated as world, not as time or not as earth. Earth would certainly be a place word. Time would certainly be a time word. What would world be? Well, it's kind of an ambiguous term, is it not? Is it a time word or a place word? Or is it a combination of both? And so the languages, Latin and Greek, have two different words to express this. They've got other words besides these as well, but they've got seculum, Latin, which is a time word, often more literally translated age, and mundus, which is a place word. The Greek, I'll just show you the Greek, and we'll discuss this later because we're going to look at this in ethics when we get through with all the introductory things and go back to the Bible itself. But the Greek has this in two different words that are entirely different words. First of all, it has its time word, ion, Greek, transliterated into English, and then we get our word eon from that. That's a time word, an age word. And that equals exactly this word in Latin, seculum. They're both time or age words. Then, Greek also has another word, and by the way, the point is this is often translated as world. For instance, many for instances here, but in Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world. World? Well, what do we mean by world? Time or place? Let us know, one or the other. Well, the Greek has this term here, ion. Be not conformed to this age, to this time. The Greek has another word that's a place word, which is this, cosmos. Transliterated K-O-S-M-O-S. And then we get all types of words from that, as you can see. The cosmos. And you even use that word, even though it's a Greek word, transliterated just in the English language sometimes. Now, that's not the word found in Romans 12:2. Be not conformed to this cosmos, which literally is translated world. No, be not conformed to this ion, this age. So, let's go back to our terms. This is a term that we are concerned about. Seculum, since we're talking about secular. Let's come back to this. Well, I better not erase that in case you don't have all of that down. Therefore, what I would say about seculum, you see, if I were to ask you, maybe I should have started this off with a question, what do we mean by secular? How would you describe that? If someone said, what do you mean by secularism? What would be your definition? See if you can give me one without any of this. And you got to be honest and forget all of what I just given you. What would be your definition of secular or secularism? How would you tell someone? How would you tell them what it is? See, it becomes very helpful if you know the origin of terms in some other language, because they'll give you the, quote, literal meaning, unquote, and then you can say, oh, now I understand. I use that term secular all the time. Well, that's secular. These people are involved in secularism. What are they involved in then? You've laid a heavy charge on their shoulders. Now, can you justify it? And they say, well, what do you mean I'm secular, or this is secularism? You would probably say something about, well, you don't believe in God. The term has nothing to say about that. Well, you don't believe in morals, has nothing to say about that. If you were to say, you don't believe in heaven and hell, oh, that it does have something to say about that. Because what is it? It's a time word. Heaven and hell deal with the next life. It's an age word. You don't believe in eternity. You don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now you're correct in your accusations. Obviously, these people also don't believe in God, but that's not what the word means. Literally, seculum is a time word that means age, of this age. A secular person would therefore be a person of this age. By implication, one who therefore denies another, or in Christian theology, who denies the next life. Mundus is a place word. World in the literal, geographical sense. So we get important derivative words from these in English. We get secular. We get what? Mundane. That's mundane. All you're saying is that is of this geographical world here. That is of this world. Well, that may be good. That may be bad. I mean, a lot of what we experience is mundane, and it's good. You have to have a mundane home. It has to be a home of this world. It's all right. It's good to have one of the next, but it won't help you for right now. Your home is mundane. Your home is secular, too. Your car is mundane. Your car is secular. It's of this age and of this planet. Nothing wrong with the terms until you take them beyond just the literal meaning and turn them into a worldview. Now, I would say that at the end of the day, to use a figure of speech I often like to use, at the end of the day, that means that after you've fought and wrestled, and because I sometimes just grow weary of reading everything everybody has to say about it, I always want to reduce it and say, well, at the end of the day, what do we have? That means it doesn't matter what all the ins and the outs are. The only thing that matters is what do we have at the end of the day. Whenever everything has been said and done, what do we have? So at the end of the day, I don't think it makes a lot of difference whether we use ion or cosmos, seculum or mundus, whether we use age, world in the geographical sense, because of this, the fact that the Scriptures have so closely tied together this world and this age. Meaning by that the destruction of one is the destruction of the other. The end of one is the end of the other. If that were not true, then we want to be sure to keep these words separated from one another. World is one word in the geographical sense, time or age in the time sense as another, and the two never to be united with one another. I think at the end of the day it doesn't matter. And that's because the Bible coincides the end of one with the end of the other. That when this age comes to an end, it's signified by the renovation of the earth. The heavens and the earth will pass away with a great heat, and God will create a new heavens and a new earth. And that the flip side of that is true also. Whenever the world passes time, whenever time or this age passes, so does the world. The tombstone of an early Christian theologian had a famous inscription on it, and it read, Athanasius contra mundum. I've given it to you in the English many times. Athanasius against the world. That's all Athanasius' tombstone, a 4th century church writer, has. Athanasius, you have to know Latin to get the meaning out of it. Athanasius contra mundum. Now, he's chosen our other word, or whoever wrote that, obviously he didn't, someone else did, has chosen our other term. Athanasius contra mundum. Chuck Colson, in his book Loving God, has that as a title for his book, Contra Mundum, chapter 16, Loving God, Chuck Colson. I've never forgotten it since I saw that in his book because I knew that was on the tomb of Athanasius. Athanasius Contra Mundum, Chuck Colson, in his book Loving God, entitles his 16th chapter, Contra Mundum. Now, whenever, as I say, we get through all of these worldviews and actually return to the New Testament itself, because we're asking ourselves the question concerning worldliness. What is worldliness? And may the Christian be worldly. Notice the term that we have there, world. You see, we've got that ambiguous term there. Is it a time word or a space word? Or are the two so closely united in the New Testament that one actually is the other? And again, don't think that I'm saying something that I'm not. There is a slight distinction. I'm just saying at the end of the day, since one passes with the other, then it would be appropriate to unite them together, and what you see in one, you see in the other. But for instance, John, you see, is very prone to use this term, whereas Paul is very prone, to use this term. Paul is prone to use the time word, eon, and John, the writer in the New Testament, is very prone to using the cosmos term. But again, John does not mean by that the earth in the most literal geographic sense. He means something else, and we will get into what he means by that later.
For the continuation of this
he means something else, and we will get into what he means by that later. That is the crux of the whole matter of worldliness as discussed from a New Testament basis. What does John mean by cosmos? Once you get that, you've got the Bible's expose of worldliness, and it does not appear under a very good light. Okay, back to our term seculum. All I'm trying to say is really there's nothing wrong or evil about the term seculum or about the term secular. It simply means, in the literal sense, as its etymology suggests, something of this time or age. Something of this time or age. Everything that we have in a physical, visible sense is secular. Our clothes, our possessions, all of these things, these are secular things. They are of this time or age, and although we're not going to concern ourselves with mundus, so we're not going to come back to that other Latin word, everything that we have is mundus also. It is of this world. I just wanted you to see that one is a time word and the other is a space word. God, with his eternalness, would be free from the time word. God, with his omnipresence, would be free from the space word as well. But whenever we add a suffix or add the suffix ism, then we drastically change its meaning, although the root idea is going to remain consistent throughout any form of secular, such as secularity or secularism. The root idea of this age will remain. But we turn it from just, quote, neutral, unquote, to a worldview. Now let me discuss some related words. I'm talking about English words here, some related English terms that you often see either used in the company of secular or secularism, or that you see used synonymously with secular or secularism. For instance, you often see the two words secular humanism together. Secular humanism. Now I'm talking about other terms used by Christians in a negative sense. I mean, if you ever see secular, it's almost always together with this other term. If you ever see humanism, it is almost always together with the term secular. Jerry Falwell, these people have made a big thing about these two terms here. Secular humanism. That's probably the strongest outcry from the Christian homeschool or private school movement. Secular humanism has taken over the educational system. So let's discuss these words and some others to see what the similarities are and what the differences are. As I said with secular, let's give ourselves the whole term secularism, you probably would really not have been able to tell anybody before this morning what you were talking about. And that's always a shame of terms. It's good that we've got a feeling for them. And so let's go back to the at the end of the day idea. At the end of the day, I guess it's okay. Even if you can't explain it, you know what you're talking about. But before we get to the end of the day, since we're only at the beginning of it, I think it's good also to kind of know what the words mean. In case someone, and not only in case someone asks you, but so you can ask yourself and answer it. What do I mean by secularism? Well, if you have this and nothing more, you've got it. It means of this age. It means of this age, with the idea of a denial of any other. We're people of this age, but only in the physical temporal sense. In the ultimate sense, we're not people of this age. We are people of another age. That's the whole message of Christianity. So what's the difference then between secularism and humanism? Well, look at the origin of these terms. Look at the root of the terms. Although you're going to always end up with something that's anti-God and anti-Christ in these words we're looking at, they're saying something slightly different. In other words, they are all, as it were, pieces of one pie. A pie is a pie is a pie. But secularism is going to say one thing about it. Humanism is going to say another thing about it. And you almost have to put all the words together before you've said everything. And because there are so many, my suggestion would be drop them all except secularism, and when you've said that, you've said it all. It is the umbrella, the dominant one, that shields all of the other worldviews. So humanism, what is that? That is a glorification of man, of humanity. The Greek maxim was that man is the measure of all things. Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things. Well, now what's the difference between secularism and humanism? Well, you can just look at your terms. You can define that yourself. You said, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to be at the same place. But you've really given us two different approaches to this anti-God, anti-Christ way. One is a time word, of this age. There is no other age. There is no life after death. By implication, of course, there is no God who says that there is life after death. If you're denying that there is, and he said that there is, you're denying him in the process. But not right out in the open. It's simply concerned with this time and this age. What about humanism? Well, again, you've not really said anything about God. I mean, atheism would be the term we'd have to say something specifically about God. There is no God. Atheism, there is no God. Humanism, it doesn't say there is no God. In the literal word itself, it doesn't say anything about God, for or against him. It simply says something about man, that man is the measure of all things. But haven't you said something about God in the process of saying that man is the measure? You've said God isn't the measure then. See, none of these words, unless we use our term atheism, say anything about God. They're pieces of the same pie, slices from the same pie, that give us a complete picture. Let's throw another term up here. Rationalism. Rationalism. This is essentially the same as intellectualism. Now they'd be very hard to distinguish between those two. Most of these you can distinguish between them. It'd be very hard to distinguish between intellectualism and rationalism. This would say that man's own mind is our supreme authority. Man's own mind is our supreme authority. Now you see, that is a worldview. Anytime you're adding ISM to a word like these, you have a worldview. Secularism, humanism, rationalism, or intellectualism. You see, humanism doesn't say anything about the mind of man. It just glorifies man himself. Now, included in man would be his mind, but it doesn't say anything about the mind. Rationalism or intellectualism says something just about the mind, not everything else. Humanism could include a lot more, you see, than just the mind. So what you want to see through this little exercise that we're doing are the distinguishing marks between these terms. Then let's add another word up here, naturalism. Naturalism. Well, all things can be accounted for by natural causes and explanations. Naturalism. Nothing wrong with the term natural. Naturalism is something else, though. All things can be accounted for by natural causes and explanations. Now you see, we're not going to discuss all of these words here because these words are so similar to one another. It's one pie, and what is a pie? It's secularism. And they're all coming at it from different angles. Of this age, which by implication means not of the other. Of man, by implication nothing outside of man. Rationalism, of our mind, by implication not anything such as faith or anything that's mystical or metaphysical. Naturalism, of nature and what nature says, not anything that is extra, or we generally use this term, that is supernatural. Naturalism is one thing, supernaturalism is obviously another. So naturalism says that everything has a basis and an explanation from what we can see in nature. Naturalism. A term closely related to this would be modernism. Modernism. I wouldn't really separate that. I'd say that modernism and naturalism are pretty much the same, just as are rationalism and intellectualism. But modernism would be a little more specific as a time word, the word modern. It would say that all things can be accounted for by modern scientific explanation. That's essentially saying the same thing as naturalism in my book. Modernism. All things can be accounted for by scientific explanation. And let's look at the reverse then. We'll see the reverse of naturalism would be anti-supernaturalism. So modernism would be anti anything old. And here, of course, the old thing would be the record of the Bible. That's pre-scientific, prehistoric, pre-modern. So modernism rejects that which is old, unless, of course, the old agrees with them. But it rejects the old, and something is specifically meant here by a rejection of the old, and that is the record of the Bible. So it's okay to be a modern person. I think we're all modern people. From the way you're dressed and the way you got here this morning, you're modern. But modernistic, a modernist, practicing modernism, no, you've changed the meaning now. You've gone beyond just the neutral term modern. Same is true with natural. When you say naturalism, you've gone beyond the term. Both of these deny supernatural causality. If it can be explained on the basis of natural processes via scientific analysis, there I've just joined the two, naturalism and modernism. If something can be explained on the basis of natural causes via scientific analysis, then what we've done as the reverse is, in effect, we've denied any extra-natural causality. Or we could go back to our Latin word mundane, any extra-mundane, other than this world, above this world, any extra-mundane causality. So in other words, these terms all basically define the same notion, but from different aspects. And I would give you a biblical analogy. These all basically describe the same thing. In other words, what I'm saying here is secularism is a worldview we're going to discuss. These other words I've just given you we're not going to. What I say about secularism is true about all of the rest of these as well. It's just they're approaching their denial of God from a different perspective. Let's say whenever you come to pragmatism. Well, now pragmatism isn't exactly like any of these that we've just said. That would be something that would be worthy of discussing itself. Existentialism. It's not in this ballpark. These are the words that are related to this chief term, secular or secularism, that we're going to put all together and not have anything else to say about them. What did I say I was going to do? I'm going to give you a biblical analogy of how I'm using these words as all basically defining the same thing from different points of view. The New Testament, for instance, gives these terms. To describe one and the same office that we call in English pastor. Pastor. And this can be clearly shown. Acts 20, 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, especially Acts 20 and Titus 1, can very clearly show that all three of these words are quote-unquote synonymous terms. Now, if you really want to get into linguistic discussions, I think what we could say at the end of the day, there's no such thing as synonyms, but I won't surprise you with that. I'll save that for some other time. There are no such things as synonyms. That's just a name for nothing. But as we understand them, synonyms, these are all synonyms of one another. But they're saying different things. They're saying different things. Bishop, which I really should give you what the literal word is overseer. Overseer, elder, shepherd. These are describing the same office from three different points of view concerning function, just concerning several different things, as you can see yourself. I'll let you make up what they're saying. Overseer, elder, and shepherd. I guess overseer is right in the word, oversee. Shep, well, you'd shep the herd. Well, you wouldn't get too much out of that, I guess, but we know what shepherds are. Elder, you're familiar with 1 Timothy 3, that says don't put someone who's a novice, who's newly converted to the faith, in that role. It's all right to have the church filled with people who are newly converted to the faith. That's where they've got to come. But you can't have a pastor who has been newly converted to the faith. In other words, what that speaks of is he has to have some time to grow and come to some spiritual maturity and spiritual understanding of things. So different things are being said about that man. And it's not sufficient just to call him an overseer. You've just said one thing about him and he oversees. Well, what else do we need to say or can we say about him? Or if we just call him a shepherd or we just call him an elder. Those are good terms, but they're inadequate terms. They don't say enough. All right? The same is true with all these other words that I've just given you. None of those terms say enough. We're going to put secularism at the top because it's the best of the words to use. Because it is broad. Of this age. Man in this age, man's mind in this age, natural causes in this age. It's the broadest of the term. But I think we need to put all of these words together to get our best meaning. Now, the only word that I gave in that list that does not necessarily fit in the same boat as the others, I'm just going to add a footnote here, might be that term rationalism. That's because, as I've said last time, one of the lost premises of philosophy is reason or logic as man's faithful guide. But at least you would have logic or reason in the third sense in which we define it. In other words, rationalism and existentialism can't necessarily go together unless we define rationalism in a way that leaves room for existentialism. That would be the way I would say it. Now, that may have gone over your head a little bit. In other words, let me say it like this. Definitely, people in America today believe in these terms: secularism, humanism, naturalism, modernism. And they believe in rationalism and intellectualism as long as you define it in a certain way. But if you define it the wrong way, then you're going to run up against existentialism. How can we have a country that's controlled by existentialism as well as controlled by rationalism or intellectualism? One word speaks of the processes of the mind. The other speaks of extra mind experience, that you come to knowledge on things apart from any logical, quote-unquote, or reasonable or rational deduction of matters, that you have an experience with things, and that's how you come to know it. So I'm just adding this footnote on to make sure that I'm totally right in what I'm saying, that although I think I would put rationalism here, it would be in the deficient sense in which we defined it earlier. There's nothing wrong with being rational or intellectual if we mean by that you believe the only way to end up with correct conclusions is to add your evidence up carefully, consistently, and then you'll have it. But most people, of course, don't do that. They take the evidence and they misconstrue it, and they gain maybe some faulty ideas, or maybe they join faulty evidence with good evidence, or maybe they take all good evidence and connect it improperly. I mean, there is a way of doing that. People do that with the Bible all the time. They take evidence from nowhere but the Bible. The Bible says this, and it says this, and it says that. Just quoting from the Bible. Well, your interpretation, at the end of the day, is dependent on how you connect those matters. For instance, let me show you something that I was sharing with some of you up at the pulpit here a while back. If you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5, which reads, "But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head." Verse 10, "For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels." Now that would seem to say, we didn't read anything else, that would seem to say that women may pray or prophesy in church with their head covered. All right, then turn over to 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 34. Where the same author in the same book to the same people writes, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak." Well, I don't know any way to pray or prophesy except to speak. So here's what happens. You either are going to put 11 at the top of your theology on this business and explain chapter 14 in light of it, or you're going to put chapter 14 at the top and explain 11 in light of it. And you're going to end up with two different conclusions here. We've got the same evidence, 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14. How do we put the evidence together? You see, over here what you'd say is Paul says silence. What does silence mean? Does that mean that you can pray and prophesy? Not my definition of silence. Silence means silence. All right, then what's going on back here? Well, the women were doing it, and Paul doesn't agree with them doing it. He can't, because he said to be silent in chapter 14. He can't agree with them, but he simply says, if you're going to do it, then wear a head covering. And that'd be similar to what Moses did in Deuteronomy 24. Moses didn't agree with divorce in Israel, did he? But didn't he make some allowances for it? If you divorce, then this is what's going to take place. You can't go back to your original husband. And of course, what the Jewish people did is they took that as a proof that Moses agreed with divorce. And Jesus said, no, from the beginning it was not so. then the only way you could explain that is Moses disagreed, the people were going to do it anyway, and so he made some laws concerning it, or God gave some laws concerning it. So Paul said to be silent. We had to start with chapter 14. Then we explain 11 in light of that they were talking when they shouldn't be. And so Paul said, well, if you're going to do it, like throwing up your hands in the air, despair, Paul said, well, if you're going to do it, at least show some submission by wearing a head covering. Now, what would these people do? They would say that Paul first, before we get to 14, we've got to read 11. And it was given and written in that order. Paul said, when your women pray and prophesy, they are to wear a head covering, so that means Paul agrees with them praying and prophesying. All right, then we get to chapter 14, silence must be interpreted so as not to rule out praying and prophesying, or you've got Paul contradicting himself. So here you end up with women cannot speak at all. I mean, this is the no speaking position over here. And here, and we're not even asking, well, what about other verses? See, then you've got to bring all these other verses to bear on this. Here we have qualified speaking. And then, of course, you can bring in, you see what I'm doing here? It depends on how you relate the evidence here. How are you going to relate it? How do you know the other way that you choose not to is wrong? How would you defend your position? Then another position we could draw in here, we have to write in Galatians 3:28. There is neither male nor female in Christ. So this is unqualified speaking. I mean, it throws out, it doesn't even have to deal with the chapter 11 problem in Corinthians. It's not in Corinthians. And it certainly wouldn't arrange things in this order. So it just throws everything out, unqualified speaking. Well, there are three choices. No speaking, qualified speaking, unqualified speaking. We're all using the same passages. If you're a Galatians 3 person, you've got to still interpret 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. If you're a 1 Corinthians 11 person, you've got to deal with Galatians 3:28. If you're a 1 Timothy 2 person, you've got to deal with 1 Corinthians chapter 11. There's the evidence. How do we put that together? You see, a lot of people today, and we go back to our definitions, the 1, 2, 3 definitions that I gave you of logic. It's not that we are opposed to logic or reason, but they have to be used properly. You can't misconstrue the evidence or misconnect things so that what you'll end up doing is blowing a fuse spiritually at the end of the day. And that's exactly what the church is doing all the time. But then we've got other people in the church who don't even believe you need to get into these technical discussions of, well, what does this say, or what does the Greek say? They just say, well, what has God shown you as a Christian? I mean, you were a woman and He saved you and He gave you liberty and freedom in Christ, and so obviously you can speak and teach and lead and pastor. What has He done for you? He set you free in your life. Well, that's a non-rational approach then to it. Non-rational. I don't necessarily mean anti-rational. It's certainly non-rational. We're not going to think about the matter. There's no rational reason involved in it. What we're going to do is go according to our own experience. And there you've got existentialism. And I think that more often today you'll have not the first understanding of true logic, but you'll either have the false understanding of logic and reason, or you'll have existentialism, depending on the people. Generally depending on the education that they've had, or depending on their security and their proof text that they have. If they feel secure, they'll use proof text from a non-rational point of view. I mean, it won't go according to our first definition of rational or reason. If they don't feel secure in their proof text, they're going to throw the Bible out and say, well, here's what the Lord has shown me. Well, these aren't reliable ways, you see, to come to truth on things. The Lord has shown me this. It seems like the Word contradicts it, but this is what the Lord has shown me. Or I've joined these passages together, but it just doesn't seem like all of them are able of explanation, or capable of explanation with the system that I have. So this is something I was showing some of the people up at the pulpit here a few services ago, of an example of how you have to deal with these matters. Whatever position you come up with, it has to be able to be complete. Like secularism is a complete worldview, everything else comes underneath it. Your view has to be complete so that everything comes underneath it. And I don't think that we've got this and that, two things that oppose one another in Scripture. But we have one consistent way of looking at any issue. And God is simply giving us a full amount of evidence. Sometimes the evidence, people construe it into being against and for something, like these passages here. But I think that's a total misreading of the situation. God hadn't given us some Scriptures in favor of it and some against to confuse us. He's given us what fallen reason and man sometimes look like for and against, but it's only because He's given us complete evidence. And I'll say some more things about that somewhere else when we come back to the subject of healing, divine healing and sickness, because we know how people try to deal with those sickness passages in the Bible. And they think that what we have here are two different views, divine sickness and divine healing. And people line up on their side. And that's not the way that we should read Scripture.